Hey there, cowboy, or at least that's what you'd like to imagine yourself as. A cool, dusty stranger riding into town at sunset, spurs jingling, coat flapping in the breeze, ready to sip whiskey, win a poker game, and maybe exchange steamy glances with the saloon girl who's definitely not what she seems. But let's be real. If we dropped you into a real Wild West town, no prep, no cheat codes, you wouldn't last a day. Maybe not even till noon. You'd choke on the dust, step in something awful within 10 minutes, and probably get food poisoning from the first thing you ate. If you didn't get shot by a drunk stranger, bitten by your own flea-infested boots, or swindled by someone named One-Eyed Pete, you'd still be passed out in a horse trough by sundown, wondering how romance novels got it so wrong. So before you tuck in for the night, turn down the lights and get ready to drift off. Let's take a slow ride through the twisted myth of frontier life. And spoiler alert, it wasn't all saloon swing doors and rugged independence. It was filthy, lawless, loud, and weirdly wet in all the wrong ways. So let's mosey through the real reasons you wouldn't survive your first 24 hours in the untamed, unwashed chaos of the Old West. You arrive in town at dawn covered in trail dust and optimism. That'll be the first thing to go. Your horse is limping, your water flask is empty, and your teeth already hurt. The streets are mostly mud and manure, with a healthy mix of tobacco spit and things better left unexamined. You try to smile at a passing child. He flips you off with a hand missing 2 fingers and keeps running. Welcome to civilization. You squint toward the saloon. It's loud, smells like sweat, regret, and burnt beans, and the front door swings just long enough to show a man passed out under the piano. There's yelling, something breaks, and a scream echoes from upstairs. Probably a typical breakfast scene. You decide maybe food first, but the general store only has bullets, chewing tobacco, a few stale hardtack biscuits, and a suspicious can labelled meat product. The owner's beard is long enough to braid and has possibly never moved since last Thursday. You wander over to the bathhouse to rinse off the road, but baths cost extra, the water is reused between customers, and there's already a line of very angry men who haven't changed their socks in 3 months. You could try the river, but there's a solid chance of snakes, leeches, or someone trying to rob you while you're bent over washing. Okay, maybe lodging. The hotel is just a 2-story wooden shack with cracked windows, thin walls, and a shared outhouse with splinters in all the worst places. There's no key, just a polite suggestion you wedge a chair under the doorknob if you don't want surprise visitors at 3 a.m. At this point you're thinking, I'll get a drink, meet the locals. Bold move. The saloon is packed with miners, cowhands, drifters, and one guy asleep in his beans. The bartender eyes you like you just insulted his horse. You ask for whiskey and get something that tastes like turpentine filtered through boot leather. But hey, it burns less than your rapidly developing rash. Someone invites you to a card game. The stakes are whatever you're willing to lose. You pretend to understand the rules. 10 minutes in, a man accuses you of cheating. You didn't, but that doesn't stop him from slamming his hand on his gun. Suddenly the piano stops. Someone coughs. You blink. He laughs. Just kidding, he says. Everyone laughs. You try, but it comes out as a wheeze. You excuse yourself and leave, quickly. Outside, it's already high noon. You hear gunshots. No one reacts. That's just Tuesday. You duck behind a barrel just in case. Inside is... Let's not talk about what's inside. By mid-afternoon, the local sheriff makes his rounds. He's 78 years old, missing a few teeth, and doesn't believe in asking questions, just warnings. His badge is carved from wood. He tells you to stay out of trouble. You nod. Trouble, meanwhile, walks past in a corset and cigar smoke, blows you a kiss, and vanishes into the brothel upstairs. As the sun starts to set, you finally find a spot to sit and take it all in. A town of contradictions. Lawless, but loyal. Dangerous, but weirdly welcoming. loud but never boring. It smells like blood, beans and horses, and it's growing on you. Until someone drops a bucket of something questionable from the second-story balcony and it hits your hat, which was your only clean item. You sigh. Welcome to the West. You try to sleep that night on a straw mattress that crunches with every movement. A dog howls in the distance. Somewhere a drunk cowboy sings off-key. Two men argue over who cheated at dice. A fistfight starts under your window. And you're still awake, questioning all your life choices. That's the Wild West. It was gritty, violent, unhygienic, barely functional, and weirdly poetic. And we've only scratched the surface. Because if you think you'd make it to nightfall, you haven't tried the beans yet. So if you're still awake, and if you are, you're tougher than most, you'll want to stick around. Because next we're diving into one of the most dangerous things on the frontier. Not the outlaws, not the duels, the food. Because if the whiskey didn't kill you, the breakfast beans just might. Let's talk about the food. Because if you ever find yourself in a real Wild West town, you'd better lower your expectations. Then bury them behind the outhouse next to the grave of the last guy who ate the stew. See, you might think frontier life was all about sizzling steaks over open campfires, beans bubbling in iron pots, and cowboy coffee steaming in tin mugs under a sky full of stars. And technically, yes, that happened. But what they don't tell you is that the steak was usually stringy jackrabbit. The beans were cooked in water you absolutely shouldn't drink. And the coffee, well, it was less Arabica roast and more burnt mud with twigs. Here's the thing. Food in a Wild West town wasn't meant to be good. It was meant to not kill you immediately. That was the bar. And even then, it often failed. Start with the basics. Beans. You ate beans because they lasted. Dried, bagged, and flavourless, they could survive months on a wagon. But once they arrived, they had to be rehydrated using whatever water you could find, often creek water shared with livestock and the occasional bloated raccoon carcass. You'd boil them for hours in battered pots over fires stoked with cow dung. No, really, fuel was scarce. Cow patties were free. And don't get any big ideas about seasoning. Salt was valuable. Pepper was rare. Spices. You were lucky if you had wild onions or lard with some leftover flavour in it. Most meals tasted like sadness and metal. Then there was hardtack, a type of cracker if you're being generous. More accurately, it was a medieval building material masquerading as food. You'd soak it in coffee or stew to soften it, or you'd just break your tooth and pretend you meant to do that. The weevils inside, protein, frontier logic, fresh meat. Ha! Sure, if you had a gun and knew how to shoot. You could hunt rabbits, prairie chickens, maybe even deer if you were lucky, but you'd have to skin it, gut it, cook it, and not get shot by a jealous neighbour who wanted your meat. Alternatively, you could buy meat at the local butcher, who may or may not have stored it next to his saddle, in a room crawling with flies, at a temperature no living bacteria should survive in. Summer meat turned green in hours. Winter meat froze so hard it had to be thawed with a knife and prayer. Then came the mystery meat. You didn't ask. The menu said stew. You ate it. If you found a toenail, you swallowed and moved on. Some saloons got creative. Possum gumbo, snake strips, prairie dog fritters. If it had legs and wasn't currently someone's pet, it could end up in the pot, including horse, including other things. Eggs were a luxury. So was milk. Both spoiled quickly. You might find preserved versions, powdered eggs, condensed milk, but they had the consistency of regret and the flavour of rust. As for vegetables, good luck. Most towns didn't have working farms nearby. Carrots were a rumour. Lettuce was witchcraft. The closest you got to greens was dandelion leaves or whatever grew between the saloon floorboards. Some folks tried pickling. Others just chewed tobacco and accepted the slow descent into scurvy. And then there was prairie butter, which wasn't butter at all, but a kind of mashed animal fat mixed with herbs or flour. It looked like lard, smelled like cheese and melted like a bad idea. But it kept. That was enough. Drinks didn't help. Whiskey could double as paint thinner. Coffee was often made from roasted acorns or scorched grain. Some used dried beets. Others brewed cowboy tea. Just hot water with whatever leaves they found that didn't immediately cause hallucinations. And yes, people died from food. Botulism, food poisoning, dysentery. It wasn't just something you died from on the Oregon Trail game. It was a Tuesday. But what about the nicer places? You know, the ones with real menus, velvet curtains, and piano music that didn't end in a fistfight. Sure, if you were in a boomtown that struck gold or near a railway stop, you might get fancier meals, imported goods, maybe even fruit. But they came at a steep price, and even then, the fruit might arrive fermented or rotten. The flour had weevils, the sugar was coarse, and that fancy stew still had possum. What makes it worse is that many settlers were immigrants, bringing food traditions with them. Germans with sausages, Chinese labourers with noodles, Mexicans with beans and spices. But the ingredients were often missing, so recipes became tragic reinterpretations. A Polish dumpling made with stale biscuit and beef tallow. An Italian sauce using canned tomato and cactus. Everyone was improvising with what they had, and what they had was usually bad. Holidays were no exception. Thanksgiving on the frontier could mean squirrel stew and a single biscuit split 5 ways. Christmas meant dried apples if you were lucky. Birthdays meant you survived. That was the gift. Still, people made do. They traded recipes, hoarded spices, told stories to distract from the flavour, and passed down strange traditions, like frying dough in bear grease or adding crushed peppermint to stew just to feel something. And somehow it bonded them. Eating the same terrible meals day after day gave people something to laugh about, or cry about, or write angry poems about, and occasionally, when the stars aligned, and a wagon rolled in with something actually edible, flour that wasn't mouldy, beans that didn't crunch, they threw feasts. They cooked, they shared, they celebrated. Because food wasn't just about survival. It was the one moment you could feel human again. So the next time you're staring at your fridge thinking, there's nothing to eat, just remember, at least you're not chewing on powdered egg chunks while a stranger bleeds on the saloon floor next door. And speaking of strangers on saloon floors, that brings us to the next reason you wouldn't last a day out here. Because even if you survived the food, the hygiene might finish you off. And if the food didn't kill you, hygiene definitely had plans. You might think the Old West was rough, dirty, and maybe a little unwashed. That's adorable. It was in fact a full-on sensory assault of filth, funk, and fluids you'd rather not name. Bathing wasn't a daily thing. It wasn't a weekly thing either. It was a when absolutely necessary event, like church funerals or cholera outbreaks. There were bathhouses, sure, but they charged for every drop. Most people just went without. Because when water is scarce and dust is everywhere, washing up becomes more theoretical than practical. And when someone did take a bath. Let's talk about that process. You'd walk into a hot, smoky room that smelled like boiled socks and wet leather. The tub? Wood? Splintered? Questionably stable. The water? Heated once. Used by multiple people. So if you were first in line, lucky you. If you were third, congratulations, you're soaking in 2 other people's skin flakes, foot funk, and possibly a minor plague. Soap was homemade, slippery, and usually smelled like bacon. Shampoo, tri-lye, mixed with sand, rubbed in with fingernails and optimism. Laundry didn't fare much better. You had 1 or 2 sets of clothes, maybe 3, if you were fancy or had fewer bullet holes than usual. Clothes were washed when they could no longer stand up on their own, or when lice formed unions. The process involved a washboard, freezing water, coarse soap, and an aching back. Dryers, the sun, or the side of your horse, whichever came first. Underwear? Optional. In fact, in many cases non-existent. Long johns were common, worn for weeks at a time without removal, which means, yes, people just kind of stewed in themselves. The odours were profound. Entire towns developed their own aroma, a mix of sweat, tobacco, livestock and despair. Visitors noticed. They just didn't say anything, mostly because their throats were already closing from the dust. And speaking of livestock, there were animals everywhere. Chickens under porches, pigs in alleys, horses tied outside every building, pooping constantly. The ground was a minefield of manure. You didn't dodge it, you accepted it as part of life. Children played in it, adults tracked it indoors. Even upscale saloons had sawdust floors specifically so the blood, beer, spit and mud would have somewhere to go. Let's talk toilets, or the lack thereof. Most people used outhouses, small rickety wooden structures behind homes or buildings, often tilting dramatically. They were rarely cleaned, deeply feared, and full of flies the size of hummingbirds. You'd walk in, try not to breathe, try not to look down, and pray the wood didn't collapse beneath you. During winter, the seat froze. During summer, the smell could melt your eyebrows. And if you were out on the trail, you dug a hole, maybe, if you had time, which you often didn't. Toilet paper? Nope. You used corn cobs, leaves, pages from old catalogues, or whatever felt least dangerous. Infection was common. Embarrassment wasn't. You didn't talk about it. Everyone suffered equally. Let's not forget dental hygiene. It didn't exist. Toothbrushes were twigs or cloth. Toothpaste, baking soda if you had it. Otherwise, just grit your teeth and hope they stayed in. Cavities were constant. Toothaches led to extractions, done with pliers, whiskey, and the support of two large men. There was no anaesthesia. There were no antiseptics. You either survived or added your name to the unofficial grave marker behind the barber shop. Speaking of barbers, they doubled as doctors, which means if you came in for a shave you might leave with a bandage and tetanus. Bloodletting was still in style. Leeches were a thing. Lancing boils was practically a sport. And everyone had lice. You weren't special. Lice, fleas, ticks. They were just part of the ambience. You combed them out, crushed them on a rock, and moved on with your life. And then there were the diseases. Oh boy. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox. They weren't if diseases. They were when diseases. Everyone got sick. Everyone had scars. Children often didn't make it to adulthood. Adults didn't make it past 50. Every cough was suspicious. Every fever could be your last. Quarantines were rare. Vaccines even rarer. You just hoped the local doctor's hands weren't shaking too much. Hospitals, makeshift at best. People were treated on kitchen tables with dull knives, dirty rags, and whiskey-soaked courage. Sanitation was a rumour. Surgeons didn't wash their hands. Bandages were reused. The death rate was astronomical. The survival rate was dumb luck. And then came childbirth. Giving birth in the Old West was an act of unfiltered bravery. Midwives did their best, but the risks were enormous. Bleeding, infection, breech births. Any of these could end you. Hospitals didn't exist. Pain relief was minimal. And if you survived, congrats. You got to raise a child in a world full of snakes, bullets, and stew of unknown origin. And yet, somehow, people persisted. They formed communities. They helped each other. They shared soap, advice, and herbal remedies passed down through desperate generations. They stitched wounds, pulled teeth, lanced boils, and buried the dead. Hygiene wasn't a priority, but it was a shared hardship, a way of life, a badge of survival. So if you ever find yourself transported back to a Wild West town, forget about the gunfights and bank robberies. Your biggest enemy will be the invisible army of bacteria on your boots. And if you thought that was bad, Just wait until you see what was waiting for you inside the saloon. And now you're thinking, okay, sure, the food was dangerous and everyone smelled like wet livestock, but at least I could go blow off some steam at the saloon, right? Oh, sweet summer pilgrim. No, you could not. Because Wild West saloons weren't the glamorous whiskey-soaked dens of card sharks and mysterious piano ladies you see in the movies. They were chaotic, violent, soaked in every imaginable fluid, and so loud you could hear a bar brawl 2 counties over. Let's start with the smell. Imagine wet hay, unwashed men, vomit, kerosene, stale beer, blood, cigar smoke, horse sweat, foot rot, and whatever died behind the piano 3 months ago. Now light it on fire and add a hint of spoiled pickles. That's the baseline scent. And nobody noticed because everyone inside smelled exactly the same. You'd walk in, ducking under crooked swinging doors that had long since stopped swinging, and immediately your boots would stick to the floor. Why? Because it was soaked in whiskey, beer, spit, and at least one bodily fluid that shouldn't be in a drinking establishment. Most saloons spread sawdust on the ground to soak it all up. Some used sand. One innovative establishment in Nevada just let the pigs clean the floor at night. And those floors, not level, not clean, not safe. You could trip over a dropped revolver, a boot someone forgot to wear, or a man currently unconscious and using a spittoon as a pillow. Now let's talk about who was there. You had the usual suspects. Miners covered in dust and dynamite residue, ranch hands who hadn't seen a bath since Lincoln died, drifters with mysterious pasts and missing fingers, gamblers who looked like undertakers with better hats, and cowboys with too much testosterone and not enough common sense. Add in 1 or 2 women who doubled as card dealers, dancers, and part-time romantic entrepreneurs, and the occasional preacher just there to keep an eye on sin while sipping something amber. And you, of course, wide-eyed, overdressed, probably already targeted by someone with a bad moustache and worse intentions. The saloon keeper, a man who could kill you with a glare and pour whiskey with a steady hand even during a shootout. He ran the place like a kingdom, where the rules were clear. Don't cheat. Don't fight unless it's interesting. And if you break a chair, you buy another or become one. The drinks, cheap, fiery, and frequently toxic. Whiskey was rarely actual whiskey. It was often a mix of turpentine, burnt sugar, tobacco juice, and alcohol strong enough to melt iron. Beer was warm, flat, and sometimes came with its own protein in the form of floating insects. Water was off the menu entirely. Coffee was considered a luxury. Most patrons drank to forget the taste of dinner and the fact that dysentery had a 24-hour head start. And then came the entertainment. Pianos out of tune, playing songs nobody remembered the words to, dancers stomping around in petticoats with more rips than fabric, singers who sounded like geese being stepped on, and occasionally a travelling performer, someone who juggled knives, swallowed fire, or recited Shakespeare while dodging beer bottles. But the real entertainment was always the chaos. Card games turned violent faster than you could say full house. Fights broke out over stolen drinks, cheating, insults, women, hats, and once over the last piece of cornbread. Chairs were smashed, noses were broken, and someone always got tossed out the window, even if the window wasn't open. And if someone pulled a gun, everyone ducked or joined in. Bullets flew, tables flipped. The bartender calmly kept pouring drinks. Sometimes people died, sometimes they just walked it off. Either way, the band kept playing. Of course, saloons weren't just for fun. They were also the town's unofficial everything. Need a job? Ask around. Need supplies? The barkeep knew a guy. Need a place to stay? You might end up in the attic if you didn't mind rats and walls made of hope. Need to place a bet? Buy a horse? Hire a bodyguard? Or send a message? The saloon was your one-stop shop for poor life choices. And let's not forget the upstairs. That's where things got entrepreneurial. Many saloons doubled as brothels, where business was booming and safety was optional. Women worked grueling hours in cramped rooms with no heat, no locks, and no health care. They were tough, smart, resourceful, and frequently armed. Some made good money, most didn't. All were treated like background props in a town that couldn't survive without them. For some, the saloon was a second home. For others, it was a trap. You could lose your money, your horse, your boots, your health, or your life in the span of one bad night and one worse whiskey. And yet, people kept coming. Because for all its grime, noise and danger, the saloon was the beating heart of the town. It was where you made friends, enemies, deals and mistakes. And sometimes it was the last place you were ever seen alive. So yes, you might walk into a Wild West saloon with confidence, charm and a few dollars in your pocket. But you'd walk out with a black eye, a hangover and an overwhelming sense of confusion. If you walked out at all. And as the sun rose and the piano quieted, the saloon would fall silent for a moment. Just long enough for the mop to soak up the night's blood, and for a new stranger to push through the doors, ready to repeat the cycle. But maybe the saloon isn't your scene. Maybe you're thinking of something quieter, more refined, something that smells a little less like gunpowder and regret. You know what? That's fair. Let's try something different. Let's go to the doctor. So you've survived the food, dodged a brawl at the saloon, and only mildly questioned your life choices. But then, something happens. Maybe you caught a stray bottle to the head during last night's piano fight. Maybe that suspicious stew from the general store gave you the kind of stomach pain that makes you start whispering goodbyes to your internal organs. Or maybe it's just a simple toothache. You'll walk it off, right? Wrong. Because in a Wild West town, walking it off was your only option. Medicine, as a concept, was still catching up to the rest of civilization, and it was already about 3 centuries behind. If you needed a doctor, the first thing you did was lower your standards. The second thing, head to the barber shop, because in the Old West, your local doctor might also be your barber, your dentist, your undertaker, and your moonshine supplier, sometimes all in the same visit. Walk through the swinging doors of Doc Holloway's establishment, and you'd find a single chair, a cracked mirror, and a counter covered in combs, scissors, teeth, pliers, and what might once have been a bone saw. The sterilisation process consisted of wiping tools on a dirty apron and swishing them in a cup of whiskey, if you were lucky. The doctor himself, usually a man with no formal training, a strong opinion about leeches, and a moustache that had seen things. He might have apprenticed under someone who once read a medical journal, or maybe he just inherited the title after the previous doctor bled out from his own leech treatment. There were no licenses, no inspections, no second opinions, and you, poor soul, had come in because your side hurt. Well, the doc would say, inspecting you with one eye open and one hand shaking from last night's poker loss. We can either bleed you or cut you open. This was not a metaphor. Bloodletting was still widely practiced. The belief was that illness came from imbalances in bodily fluids, especially blood. Too much blood, just drain some, with a knife, or a hungry leech. If you fainted, it meant it was working. If bleeding didn't help, the next option was purging, a mixture of castor oil, mercury and aggressive optimism, designed to flush your system from both ends. You would, quite literally, wish for death within 30 minutes. But let's say you had something more serious, like appendicitis, or a bullet wound, or a tooth that had decided to rebel against the rest of your skull. Now you were in for a real treat. Surgery was done on a wooden table, no anaesthesia, just whiskey, a rag to bite down on, and the gentle sounds of a harmonica player in the next room trying to drown out your screams. Tools included a rusty saw, a dull knife, a bucket, and someone named Clyde to hold your legs. Stitches were rare, bandages were rags, infections were practically guaranteed, antibiotics, not invented yet. Best case scenario, you survived with a cool scar and a new respect for your own pain tolerance. Worst case, Well, you got a nice pine box and a funeral procession of 4 very sorry-looking horses, and if you thought dentistry would be better, oh dear. Toothaches were common thanks to sugar, bad hygiene, and the general vibe of decay. If your tooth hurt, the solution was simple. Yank it out. No numbing, no precision, no aftercare. The doc would grab pliers, tell you to look at the ceiling and start pulling. If the tooth broke halfway out, congrats. Now you've got an open wound and a new source of chronic pain. False teeth? Sure, if you could afford them. Usually made of animal bone, ivory, or other people's teeth. You'd glue them in with tree sap or wishful thinking and hope they didn't fall out during Sunday service. Childbirth. Let's not even sugarcoat it. Giving birth in a frontier town was a gamble. Midwives did their best with clean towels and herbal teas, but the risks were sky high. Complications like breech births, hemorrhaging, or infection meant that both mother and child could die before the rooster even crowed. There were no C-sections, no epidurals, no trained surgeons waiting nearby, just prayer and perseverance. Snakebite, cauterize it, fever, strip naked and sit in a stream, broken leg, splint it with wood and hope it sets straight, head injury, if you're not dead yet, you'll either recover or become the town philosopher. Mental health didn't exist. If you heard voices, you were touched by the devil. If you had depression, you were just melancholic. If you had anxiety, you were told to go chop wood until it went away. Some townsfolk self-medicated with whiskey, others with religion, and a few with large amounts of opium sold under names like Dr. Wadsworth's Soothing Elixir for Gentle Hysteria. Speaking of which, patent medicines were everywhere. Bottles with labels like snake oil tonic, elixir of vigour, or Dr. Ben's miracle liver invigorator promised to cure anything from baldness to heartbreak. Most of them were 90% alcohol, 5% chloroform, and 5% wishful thinking. They tasted like death, burned going down, and usually just made you pass out, an effective way to forget you were sick. But for all its horror, frontier medicine wasn't entirely hopeless. There were doctors who genuinely tried, women who trained as midwives, herbalists who knew their plants, veterans who picked up skills from battlefield surgery. Communities learned what worked through painful trial and error, and when something actually helped, a salve, a tea, a trick with spider webs and pine resin, it spread fast. Still, the next time you get a splinter and reach for your triple antibiotic ointment and a band-aid, spare a thought for the cowboy who had to amputate a toe because he stepped on a nail behind the saloon outhouse. You wouldn't have lasted a day, and if you somehow survived that, well, it's time to meet your neighbours. And in the Wild West, neighbour could mean anything from a kindly farmer to a man who once ate someone during a snowstorm. Let's say you've survived your visit to the town doctor, barber, dentist, hangover specialist. You've got a few new scars, a slight limp, and a deeper appreciation for modern hand sanitizer. You limp back out into the dusty main street and think, at least I can count on my neighbours. No, you cannot. Because in a Wild West town, your neighbours weren't just the friendly folks who waved over the fence while hanging laundry. They were a mixed bag of pioneers, prospectors, preachers, outlaws, gamblers, snake oil salesmen, and men named Buck who had never once bathed without a fight. And they were all armed. It wasn't a matter of if someone had a gun. It was how many, and where they were hiding them. Pistols were worn openly on hips. Rifles hung behind doors. Shotguns rested next to rocking chairs. Kids learned how to load a revolver before they learned how to spell their own names. Guns weren't fashion statements. They were survival tools, conflict resolution methods, and sometimes, unfortunately, personality traits. You could be baking bread, and your neighbour could be building a bomb out of black powder and boredom. But let's back up. Why was everyone so on edge? Because the West was lawless. And I don't mean exciting action movie lawless. I mean nobody's in charge and the sheriff just joined the poker game lawless. Many frontier towns didn't have proper law enforcement, or if they did, it was one exhausted man with a badge, a shotgun, and no desire to actually get involved unless someone was actively on fire. Justice was often local, improvised, and wildly inconsistent. That's how you got vigilante posses, public hangings, and accidental barn fires that nobody asked too many questions about. So, your neighbours? Some were good people trying to raise families and grow potatoes. Others were criminals on the run from the east, hoping nobody would recognise their wanted poster. And then there were those in-between folks, the ones who'd maybe shot a man once in Kansas, but he deserved it. And anyway, it was a long time ago, and let's not bring it up at dinner. You learned not to ask too many questions. That quiet man next door who whittles in silence. Might be a retired bounty hunter. That chatty couple who moved in last spring. Might be grifters who skip town every time someone gets suspicious. That old woman who keeps chickens and swears at clouds. Almost definitely a bootleg moonshiner with 4 dead husbands and a shovel that never gets rusty. And yet somehow everyone coexisted. Barely. Disputes over land, water, or stolen livestock could erupt into full-on shootouts. Fence lines were hotly contested. If someone's pig wandered onto your land and rooted through your garden, that was grounds for war. Cattle drives trampled crops. Horses were stolen. Wells were poisoned, by accident mostly, or not. People lived close together but trusted no one. And that's not paranoia, it's practicality. Because there was no 911 to call, no court to settle arguments, just your own judgment, your own gun, and hopefully a few neighbours who didn't hate your guts this week. It created a strange code of honour, one part Southern hospitality, one part Game of Thrones. People greeted each other politely, brought over pies, and lent a hand when needed, but always with an eye on the other person's holster. Borrow a cup of sugar, but also double-check your cattle count when they leave. And then there were the feuds. Oh, the feuds. Families that hated each other for generations over something that happened before anyone could remember. Gunfights sparked by insults at church socials, poisoned pies, burned barns, and one spectacular case where a man allegedly trained his goat to defecate only on his rival's porch. Petty? Absolutely. Dangerous. Always. Some towns even had official bad men, the local toughs who kept order by being scarier than the people causing trouble. These were the men who'd been in more shootouts than birthdays, who had reputations sharp enough to cut through silence. They might not have been good men, but they were useful men, until they weren't. And if you think the women were any safer or softer, think again. Frontier women were often sharper than the men. They had to be. They ran households, shot intruders, delivered babies, ran businesses, and defended homesteads while their husbands went off to mine for fool's gold and gamble away the family mule. You didn't cross a frontier woman. She'd invite you in for coffee and shoot you before the kettle boiled. Even children were tough. By age 10 they could ride horses, milk cows, trap varmints, and distinguish between rabid coyotes and grumpy uncles. School was optional. Survival was not. But the wildest thing about your neighbours, despite the guns, grudges, and grim hygiene, they were your lifeline. If your barn caught fire, they'd show up with buckets. If your cow got sick, they'd offer advice. Usually bad, but well-meaning. If bandits rolled through, everyone formed a line and stood together. Because while they didn't necessarily like each other, they needed each other. The West wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance. And part of enduring meant trusting the guy next door just enough to not shoot you over a misplaced shovel. So yeah, your neighbours in a Wild West town were unpredictable, underwashed, and probably armed to the teeth. But they were also the reason you made it to sunrise. And speaking of sunrise, it's time to head into town. There's a land dispute brewing, and if you think courtroom drama is wild today, wait till you see what counts as justice in the next story. You thought having armed, drunk neighbours was dangerous? Wait until one of them accuses you of stealing his mule. Welcome to the courtroom of the American frontier. Except there usually wasn't a courtroom. or a judge, or law. Justice in the Wild West was a concept applied loosely, often creatively, and rarely with anything resembling fairness. The idea wasn't to find the truth, it was to settle things before blood hit the floorboards, and preferably after lunch. Let's say someone accuses you of a crime. Maybe you actually did steal the mule. Maybe you borrowed it. Maybe the mule walked into your yard and now thinks it lives there. Doesn't matter. There's a problem, and the problem needs settling. In bigger frontier towns, you might have a sheriff, a deputy, maybe even a town judge who is technically elected, and not just the loudest guy with a moustache. These were men, always men, who carried a gun in one hand and a Bible in the other, and weren't afraid to quote either out of context. But out in smaller settlements, justice came from whoever had the most friends, the biggest gun, or the loudest voice at the saloon. Disputes could be handled through impromptu trials held in barns, saloons, or church basements. A judge might be the local blacksmith or a barber who could read. The jury, whoever was standing nearby and didn't have immediate chores. Witnesses, optional, evidence, laughable. And if you didn't show up, the trial happened anyway. The verdict was usually shouted over someone playing the banjo. But let's say your town did have a judge and a legal process. What did justice actually look like? First, the arrest. A deputy, probably hungover, possibly illiterate, would toss you in the local jail, which was usually a wooden shack with a door that locked only from the outside, assuming it locked at all. There were no Miranda rights, no phone call, no lawyer. You just sat there, hoping the rats weren't aggressive and that someone would remember to feed you. Then came the trial. The judge sat behind a desk. The accused stood sweating in yesterday's clothes. The prosecution was whoever had the time to shout, and the defence was you. You defended yourself, unless you convinced a buddy to lie for you. Trials were short, decisions were swift, and bribery. Oh, bribery was definitely on the table. Justice wasn't blind in the Wild West, it was nearsighted, cross-eyed, and a little drunk. Verdicts depended on your reputation, your friends, and whether the judge had recently lost money in a poker game you were part of. And punishments. Oh, they were spectacularly inconsistent. Steal a horse, you might be hanged, or whipped, or fined, or just told to give it back and buy the judge a drink. Shoot someone? Depends who they were. If the victim was well liked, you were in trouble. If they were an outsider or a loudmouth, well, accidents happen. And speaking of hangings, vigilante justice was common and terrifying. If the townsfolk decided the law was too slow or too lenient, they took matters into their own hands. A lynch mob would form, usually after a few drinks and a lot of yelling, and justice would be served from the nearest tree branch. No trial, no appeal, just a rope, a crowd, and some deeply questionable moral reasoning. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they didn't, and then there were duels, yes, real ones. If two people had a serious disagreement over land, livestock, cheating, or insults, they might agree to a gentleman's solution, which usually meant standing in the street at high noon and shooting at each other in front of half the town. It wasn't always about killing. Sometimes it was about honour. Other times it was about who had the fastest hands and the dumbest pride. Dueling wasn't technically legal in many territories, but that didn't stop anyone. Sheriffs might look the other way if it settled a feud. Sometimes they watched, sometimes they bet on it. And if you won, you were fine. If you lost, you were buried. Either way, the town moved on by dinner time. Now, if you were a woman or a person of colour, the legal system became even more ridiculous. Women could rarely testify in court. Their property rights varied wildly depending on the state, and accusations against them were often dismissed or taken too seriously. People of colour, especially black, Mexican and Native American individuals, were routinely denied justice altogether, accused without evidence, Punished without defence, forgotten without consequence. It was brutal, it was unfair, it was real. But even in this chaos, some towns tried to create order. Makeshift codes were posted. Sheriffs wrote their own rule books. Miners' camps formed councils. Ranchers settled disputes with arbitration instead of bullets. Juries occasionally tried to be impartial, and a few remarkable judges actually read books and tried to apply real law. Still, the odds were never in your favour. Justice in the Wild West wasn't about what you did. It was about who you were, who you knew, and whether your boots were louder than your words. And if you somehow made it through your trial with your life and dignity intact, there was always the next danger waiting just around the bend. Because now that you're a free man, it's time to head back out on the road. And roads in the Wild West? They weren't paved, they weren't safe, and they definitely weren't free of bandits. So you've survived the saloon, the town doctor, the sociopathic neighbours, and a legal system that treated fairness like a suggestion. You've walked out of that dusty little courtroom, miraculously not in handcuffs or a pine box, and now you're ready to get out of town. Clear your head, see the frontier, start fresh. Great idea. Terrible timing. Because the open road in the Wild West wasn't a scenic drive with blue skies and chirping birds. It was a death lottery. Every mile you travelled was an invitation for disaster. Dust storms, dehydration, broken wagon wheels, outlaw ambushes, wild animals, con men, swindlers, and the occasional mysterious disappearance with nothing left but a single boot and a blood trail. Let's start with the roads, or rather the complete lack of them. Most western routes weren't roads at all. They were dirt trails pounded into the landscape by horses, wagon wheels, and desperation. In some areas, the only indication that you were on the right path was a series of bleached animal bones pointing vaguely west. Rain turned everything into sludge. Dry weather kicked up dust so thick you couldn't see your own horse's tail. You didn't ride in comfort. You bounced constantly. Broken axles were as common as blisters. And God help you if you lost a wheel in the middle of nowhere, because the closest blacksmith might be 60 miles away and already drunk, and you were never alone. Not in the way you wanted to be. The roads were crawling with people looking to lighten your load, or your life. Bandits, highwaymen, and general-purpose criminals roamed the open spaces like wolves in waistcoats. Sometimes they worked alone. More often, they worked in packs with names like the Red Rock Gang, or the Owl Hoot Boys, or those guys who killed everyone in Kansas that one time. They didn't hide in shadows. There were no shadows. Just scrub brush and sage and the occasional outcropping where someone had carved their initials and possibly died. You'd be riding along, minding your own business, maybe whistling a tune when suddenly, howdy friend. Translation, you're getting robbed. Bandits didn't play games. They didn't care about your sad backstory or your dreams of starting a farm. They wanted your gold, your horse, your boots, and maybe your coat if it looked warm. And they were fast. Before you could say, let me explain, they had your saddlebag emptied and were arguing about who got your biscuits. Some tried to fight back. Most of them were buried in shallow graves. And the worst part? If you survived the robbery, you were on foot, half naked, with no horse, no map, and no water. And that's assuming they didn't shoot you just to keep things tidy. But let's say you were clever, cautious. Maybe you joined a wagon train. Safety in numbers, right? Sometimes. Wagon trains were their own breed of madness. Dozens of travellers strung out across the landscape in a slow-moving parade of coughing oxen, bickering children, and wheels that squeaked louder than a banshee on a bad day. Progress was glacial. Accidents were frequent. Tempers wore thin fast. You might find protection in numbers, or you might find dysentery, infighting, and a group of strangers ready to throw you overboard at the first sign of trouble, not to mention the weather. A sudden flash flood could wash out your trail, a sandstorm could bury your wagon, lightning might strike the only tree for miles, and guess who camped under it? And then there were the rivers. Oh yes, if you thought fording a river was just about getting your boots wet, let me introduce you to the cold, muddy grave that claimed thousands of travellers. Wagons tipped, livestock drowned. People got swept downstream and washed up weeks later in the next county with their pockets still full of useless wagon repair manuals. But if you made it across the rivers and avoided the bandits and managed not to die of heat stroke or exhaustion or food poisoning from the last tin of Mystery Stew Deluxe, you still had to watch for con men. The West was full of smooth talkers with fake maps, fake deeds, fake mining claims, and real smiles. Sure, mister, there's gold right over that ridge. Just sign here. And by the time you realised the land was cursed, flooded, or already owned by 5 other people, the con man was long gone with your savings and your backup pair of socks. Travelling by stagecoach wasn't much better. The roads were so rough that passengers often had to be tied in to avoid bouncing out the windows. You'd sit hip to hip with strangers for hours or days while enduring dust, bandit attacks, axle breaks, and the unholy smell of someone's lunch rotting in the corner. Privacy was a myth. Comfort was a joke. And the only bathroom was a bush behind a cactus guarded by a rattlesnake named Larry. Still want to hit the road? Some people did it for money. Couriers, bounty hunters, traders. Others were chasing rumours of gold, land, or opportunity. Most were just running from something. A bad deal, a broken heart, or a town where they weren't welcome anymore. Whatever your reason, travelling in the Wild West was a gamble. You packed light, rode hard, and hoped the next sunrise didn't come with a revolver in your face. And yet, people did it. Every day. For decades. Because the alternative, staying put in a town full of questionable stew and unqualified doctors, wasn't always better. So maybe you're thinking, I'll just ride into the sunset. Sure, just make sure the sun isn't setting on you. And speaking of hope, grit, and people who risked everything for a new life, it's time to talk about the women of the Wild West. And if you thought their lives were easier, well, partner, you've got another thing coming. If you think the Wild West was all 6 shooters, spurs and saloons, you've been watching too many movies made by men with very little laundry to do. The truth is, behind every dusty cowboy balancing a whiskey glass on his moustache was a woman who'd already been up for 4 hours, delivered a calf, churned butter, and buried a chicken, possibly in that order. The women of the frontier didn't just survive, they ran the West, quietly, relentlessly, and with far fewer thank yous than they deserved. Let's start at home, because in a Wild West household, homemaker was shorthand for everything. Women didn't just sweep floors and warm soup, they managed entire ecosystems. Cooking was done over open fires or iron stoves that doubled as furnaces. Water had to be hauled from rivers, boiled, strained through cloth, and stored in heavy ceramic jugs. Laundry meant heating vats, scrubbing linens on washboards, and praying your hands didn't freeze or blister off by Thursday. And food? Nothing was pre-made. Every biscuit started as grain. Every stew began with an animal you had to kill, clean, and convince your children to eat without complaint. Women grew vegetables, raised chickens, milked cows, preserved fruits, and baked bread in ovens that burned hotter than the devil's own toenails. If a pie came out right, it was a miracle. If it came out wrong, it still got eaten. Because you didn't waste food on the prairie. You scraped off the burnt part and called it cowboy crust. But domestic chores were just the opening act. Most women also worked the land. Ploughing, planting and harvesting. They drove wagons, herded livestock, patched fences, and occasionally pulled out a rifle when coyotes or predators came sniffing around. While their husbands were off hunting gold or arguing politics at the saloon, the women kept the farm, the kids and the livestock alive. And speaking of kids, frontier women gave birth without hospitals, pain meds or maternity leave. If they were lucky, there was a midwife. If they weren't, They bit down on leather straps and hoped the baby came before the next prairie storm. Infant mortality was high, maternal mortality was higher, but you got no medal for surviving, just another mouth to feed and a husband wondering when dinner would be ready. Now let's talk about work. Actual paid, grueling, often unsung labour. Women ran boarding houses, laundries, seamstress shops and general stores. They were teachers, cooks and healers. Many widows supported entire families by themselves, doing whatever jobs came their way. And when there was no respectable work, some turned to saloons, not as dancers or bartenders, but as performers, entertainers, and yes, sex workers. Let's not sugarcoat it. Prostitution was a survival strategy in many frontier towns. Some women chose it, others were trafficked into it. All of them endured judgment from the same society that benefited from their services. And while men strutted into brothels with impunity, the women inside were often barred from public events, denied property rights, and buried in separate cemeteries. Yet despite all of this, frontier women built real power, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. Take the suffragists. The West became a testing ground for women's rights because frontier life had a funny way of revealing just how absurd sexism really was. When your wife saves your crops, teaches your kids, shoots a snake, and stitches your leg back on, all before dinner, it gets harder to argue that she's too emotional to vote. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869. Colorado followed in 1893. These weren't accidents, they were acknowledgements. Late, incomplete, but meaningful. Women were also the glue in frontier communities. They started schools, organised church groups, ran aid societies and temperance clubs. If someone fell sick or broke a leg or lost a child, it was the women who showed up first, with stew, blankets, and the kind of emotional support cowboys wouldn't admit they needed. And let's not forget the women who went beyond the norm. Stagecoach Mary was 6 feet tall, packed a revolver, and delivered mail through snowstorms. Calamity Jane could outshoot, outdrink, and outcurse most men west of the Mississippi. Belle Starr ran her own outlaw gang. These women weren't the exceptions. They were just the ones history remembered. Countless others lived equally wild lives without a single dime novel written about them. Even fashion had its own frontier logic. You picture prairie women in long skirts and bonnets, and you're not wrong. But beneath those skirts were boots caked in mud, bruised ankles, and a knife strapped to the thigh just in case. Corsets were worn, yes, but they weren't the fainting contraptions of Victorian myth. On the frontier, they were used for back support during long days of labour. A woman's dress might look prim from a distance, but up close it was patched, faded, and stained with a dozen stories no one asked about. So what did women get for all this effort? Not much. No fame, no monuments, no equal pay. Most were never photographed, never written about, never credited. Their work was called natural, or woman's duty. Their sacrifices were expected, not praised. But make no mistake, without frontier women the West wouldn't have been settled. It would have collapsed in on itself like a whiskey barrel left in the sun too long. They endured isolation, hardship, injustice, and back-breaking labour. And they did it with grit, wit, and, when necessary, a loaded shotgun under the floorboards. So the next time someone says the Wild West was a man's world, feel free to correct them. Gently, firmly, or with the ghostly echo of 1,000 prairie mothers who would like a word. And now that we've set the record straight, it's time to pay our final respects. Because in the Wild West, death wasn't just expected, it was practically a neighbour. You made it. Somehow you survived the saloon brawls, the bandits, the doctors with bone saws and questionable hygiene. You ducked the vigilantes, the weather, the dysentery, and your gunslinging neighbours. You even made peace with the rattlesnake under your porch and the sound of coyotes howling at midnight like they'd just lost a poker game. But out here, in a Wild West town, that wasn't a happy ending. Because sooner or later, sometimes sooner than later, death showed up. And when it did, it didn't knock. It kicked the door in, tracked mud across your rug, and asked if anyone was using that coffin over there. Death in the Wild West was never far away. It lived next door. It drank at the saloon. It napped in the shade of your grave plot before you even filled it. You could die from gunfire, disease, snakebite, childbirth, infection, starvation, falling off a horse, drinking bad water, eating bad stew, stepping on a rusty nail, getting trampled by cattle, or just being in the wrong place when somebody lost a card game. The average life expectancy, early 40s if you were lucky, much less if you had bad aim or worse luck. But what happened after you died? That's where things got really undignified. Let's say you keeled over on your porch, peacefully perhaps, after a long life of hard labour and harder biscuits. If you were fortunate, someone noticed before the buzzards did. A neighbour would fetch the undertaker, or the closest person who owned a shovel and didn't gag easily. Undertakers in the Wild West were rarely full-time professionals. They were often carpenters, blacksmiths, or anyone with a strong stomach and access to pine. Embalming was rare outside of bigger towns, and refrigeration was non-existent, so funerals had to happen fast. You didn't get a long goodbye, you got a box, a prayer, and maybe a fiddle tune if someone was sober enough to play it. Coffins were homemade, rough-hewn, often too short or too narrow. If you didn't fit, well, your knees might get a little bent. If the town was poor, and most were, you might be wrapped in a blanket and laid to rest in an unmarked grave on the edge of town. Just far enough that the wind wouldn't carry certain smells back into town. There were no vaults, no polished stone markers, maybe a wooden cross if someone liked you enough to whittle one, and yet, despite all that, the people of the West did mourn, in their own grim way. Families dressed in black, if they had anything black to wear. They covered mirrors. They sat with the body sometimes for a night, sometimes until the whiskey ran out. Friends would stop by to pay respects, share stories, and, in some cases, resolve any unfinished arguments, while the guest of honour could no longer argue back. And then there were the funerals. A good funeral was a community event. The preacher would read from the Bible, the women would cry quietly, and someone would mutter something awkwardly meaningful like, "Well, he sure did hate horses." If you were famous, or infamous, the funeral might draw a crowd. Gunfighters, drifters, ranch hands, everyone in their Sunday best, which looked suspiciously like their Monday worst, all paying tribute before heading back to work or whiskey. But not everyone got a ceremony. Outlaws were often buried where they fell. No prayers, no marker, no grieving widow. Just a shallow hole and maybe a boot sticking out if someone got lazy. Prostitutes and drifters were sometimes buried in separate sections of town cemeteries, or not at all. Indigenous people and immigrants were often denied burial rights altogether. Death, like everything else in the West, was brutally unequal, and it didn't stop with burial. Graves could be robbed, bodies could be misidentified, floods could wash away entire cemeteries, and if you died far from home, good luck ever getting there, unless someone really liked you and had a spare wagon, which was rare. Still, for all its mess and mayhem, death in the Wild West wasn't meaningless. People remembered. They told stories around fires, they kept trinkets and letters, they visited graves on anniversaries, even if those graves were just a pile of rocks and a half-scratched name. The dead lingered in every town, in memories, in legends, and occasionally in the attic where nobody dared to go after sundown. And that's what made it bearable. Even in a world of casual violence, indifferent nature and whiskey-soaked decisions, people cared. They held on to love, loss, and legacy, even if they expressed it with more grit than grace. So as you lay there now, wrapped in a blanket, 6 feet under the prairie sky, dust settling over your boots for the final time, know this. You survived longer than most. You endured hardship that would make modern folk cry into their lattes. You lived. You fought. You fell in love. You ate stew that should have killed you and got shot at least once. And in a Wild West town, that made you a legend. So if you've stayed awake through this long, dusty journey, first of all, you're tougher than most outlaws. And second, now's a good time to let your eyes drift closed and fall asleep to the gentle winds of a world long gone. A world of grit, ghosts and gunpowder. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more bedtime journeys through history's wildest corners. Every click helps me tell the next story and lets you rest just a little bit easier in a world that, thankfully, no longer buries folks next to their outhouse. Good night, partner.